And hello again, boys and girls. Welcome back to the channel. It's of course your host Marley Startled, and this won't be an after action review, but instead of an explanation of how the economy works, supply and demand, and why your factories aren't making profits. So the most important thing to understand about making profits through industry is ensuring that the base resource that industry uses stays cheap. So if we take a look over on our left hand side and look at our markets and say, let's take a look at the clothing industry. So clothing requires fiber to make. Now, if we look here, the base price of fiber is currently 19 coin pieces per bit of fiber, whereas of course the base product of clothing is 32 coins. This means that if a clothing industry makes clothes, or if we build a clothing industry, then of course the clothing industry will make a profit off the base resource. But if the base resource becomes more expensive, which I'll just show now, you see now that the base price for fiber has now gone up to 29 gold pieces per bit of fiber. Now, this will only get worse as time goes on. So, if we continue to build up our clothing industry, ignoring the fact that the clothing industry is now more expensive, another thing we need to take a look at is, of course, the actual base wage of a clothing industry right now, which is £6.37. So if you work at this factory, £6.37. And if we decide to keep building up our clothes industry in spite of our deficit, things will slowly start to go very badly wrong. Because eventually it'll get to the stage where the price of fiber is so expensive that the surplus of clothing is so numerous that these factories will start losing money. And then, of course, the base salary plummets, the quality of life gets worse, and things start going very badly wrong. So your main effort when controlling the markets and controlling your production is ensuring that your raw resources are cheaper than your your new product. Now, you don't want it too cheap, mind you, because then those industries or those people who work in, say, ranching will start to lose money as well. And so you need to really balance the economy around that sort of grey coinage. You don't want it to go too cheap and make it go, say, brown coinage, and you don't want to make it too expensive and make it go gold coinage, because then your economy becomes out of balance. Generally, if you keep your economy in this sort of silver level, things won't get too bad. Now you can see here what's happening is the cost of fiber is getting reduced. Now, why is that happening? Because other markets are now trading with me to fill my deficit. And so if you're quite pleasant on the political sphere, then what can happen is then you can temporarily in the long term offshoot this. But the sooner you go to war, then of course what will happen is people will stop exporting that fiber to you, or maybe potentially embargo you. Where can I find you? There you are. So you see the salary is now dumped. Now, you may be thinking, well, what's the big deal about that? Well, the big deal is that now that the clothing industry is dumped, you'll start to lose money. You see, you do not get money really off the industry itself, but you get it from the pops who pay taxes from it. So if a pop is making £6 a wage, then of course you may get £2 back in income. But if he's making £1.71 because of the loss of fibre, then of course you're going to make less money from your actual income. Equally, that population will become more disgruntled as they don't get a livable wage, and of course you will begin to see the rise of very upset pops, which is gradually growing up. Of course, we have discrimination in Austria, but nothing to be too worried about in the short term. Your main effort is to keep the price ranges in that grey coinage. If you keep the price ranges in that grey coinage, or you meet the demand of the expensive products by building more, then generally speaking your industries will remain healthy. Now if you overproduce, say, clothing, and you don't export it, then you can end up in the same situation where clothing is so cheap, the price of clothing is so cheap that again your industries don't make a profit of it. And so you end up in the same situation but in reverse. Instead of having low wages because of a lack of supply, you end up with low wages because you have too much of the end product. So there's ways we can get about sort of dodging or avoiding this. The first one is to, of course, import fiber. So if we can import them from foreign markets, We can reduce the price of fiber, but only by a little bit. We need to really keep reducing the price. You can still see here the level of profit is not enough. Oh, and now we've reduced it completely, and now we're back. So that's one way of fixing the economic issues. But of course, that means making your other nations wealthier off the backs of your industry. Also makes your industry more vulnerable to embargoes and more vulnerable to political external pressure. And so if you want to remain an independent nation, especially as a major, then your main effort will be to produce or develop your own domestic industry. There's also a way for minor nations to really capitalize on the market. So if I was, say, Sicily and I joined the Customs Museum of Austria, I would immediately start mass producing fiber as much as I can, because I know that is what is a market that Austria needs. Then that will lower the price of that fiber, and then of course their industry will become more productive and I will have a niche in the market. Of course, the big concerns you'll have in this game will be the constant balancing between keeping all of these affordable as possible. It can also lead to situations where you may not want to keep certain products affordable. For example, if you do not have a heavy clothing industry, you could potentially mass import clothing to make it cheap as chips for your own population. What I'm trying to explain here is that what you can do is potentially, if you do not have a domestic industry in, say, grain, but you want to have grain as cheap as chips so your populations are happy and content, you can import grain to the point where it's no longer productive, to the point where it's so cheap that the pops get their money's worth, and even though you've got a little tab at the top saying unproductive trade route, it doesn't matter because it is paying because it's keeping your pops happy. So if I was, say, Austria-Hungary and I did not have a grain industry, or I was not particularly interested in supporting my own grain industry or building up a strong grain industry, but I wanted my pops to have a lower standard of living, or well, a higher standard of living, I could mass import grain, and then in doing that, I would lower the price to pennies. And then by lowering the price to pennies, what would happen is, of course, the quality of life will improve, and because my domestic industry is not based on grain, no one in my own country would suffer. So it's got to be a balance between sort of how you built your economy and how certain trade routes will affect the quality of life of people in your country. Now, a little odd thing you're seeing here is now the cost of clothing is somehow going up, even though we shouldn't have enough fiber to do that. And the answer is because other foreign industries are now trading for our clothing. You can see here the French are buying it, the Sicilians are buying it, and even the Ottomans. And so although you can get away with, to a degree, having a surplus good, in the long term, through embargoes and political pressure, you could eventually have a industry that is no longer in equilibrium with itself and completely dependent on external market forces. This, of course, means that if you aren't building cleverly or building to meet your own domestic needs and depending on foreign trade as a major, you could quickly end up in a situation where most of your industries, the backbone of your industries, are dependent on foreign trade. Of course, there are ways to avoid that, potentially, of course, refusing to import resources, or even failing that, to go complete isolationism and stop foreign trade altogether. Also, some people will export to you regardless. You don't have to export, you don't have to agree to an export or manually export. Some foreign markets may export to you regardless. So we'll see here it's 34. Potentially some industries will, or some nations will export to us because of our current government that allows them to export to us, which is interventionism. Now, if we went full isolationism, which I'm going to do now to show you what would happen if you didn't have that sort of external export-import market, you could potentially see a lot worse going on. So what does this all mean? So what this effectively means is that you must keep your economy in balance. And so you must make sure that your industries are producing a more expensive product than what raw resources are going into that industry. If your raw resources are too expensive, then what will happen is then your industries will struggle. And you can avert this via importing or having nations import to you, which of course will make you vulnerable to economic plays, or you can instead build up your own domestic industry. Of course, if you do end up in a situation where you have a deficit in a resource and you need that market to stay open, say railways, then what you may need to do is subsidize your industry. And by subsidizing it, it means that your industries will buy products at a loss, which are extremely expensive. However, at buying at a loss, they still can maintain a livable wage. And so you must balance that out. So if there's anything really to go away from this video, it's simply make sure the cost of raw resources that go into your industry are cheaper than the actual product that industry produces. However, do not make them so cheap as to them for to be no longer be profitable. Do not make the clothing industry so cheap that in fact you lose money producing more clothes. Of course, you can avoid this by being in a very large customs union, or you can, of course, export your clothes onto the market, and that way you will hopefully lower the price of clothing. However, it's still important to note that one way to improve quality of life without being is to create a form of dependency on foreign nations where you do not have a domestic market in, say, grain, and so you mass import grain to lower the price of grain at the expense of your own domestic market. And in doing so, you improve the standard of living because people will spend less on grain, but you also not see too much instability from your farmers at home because the farmers at home are not numerous enough to cause too much unrest. And so, an example, if I could find enough spare grain, would be, of course, lowering the price of grain. Another example of a product being too cheap is perhaps tin. So if we take a look at tin, we can see tin is currently dirt cheap. So what we can do, or what we're going to see now, is that tin is now in fact going to make us a loss. So if we click over to tin and select our tin reserve, the wage is currently £1.59, but if we were to reduce the size of our tin, it's now gone up to 4.12. That is because the price of tin is now more expensive, and therefore people working in the tin industry are now making money. Of course, that means that anything that uses tin in the later industries, such as lead, such as the arms industry, will now make a loss. Now we've enacted an isolationism, so let's see what's happened now. You can see now our surplus of goods has overwhelmed the market, reducing the price of that good, but also reducing the actual salaries of our clothes, now being £2.12 from what it once was. So that's sort of showing you the economic system at its finest. Really, if you had to take anything away from this, it's simply make sure the raw resource is cheaper than the industrial resource that you produce. And as a miner in a customs union or just trying to make ends meet, try and meet the costly demands of foreign powers and try and meet their market demands rather than try and compete with them for their domestic goods that they have a good supply of. Austrian sweatshops. So bear that in mind, gentlemen. I know it's a bit of a roundabout way of explaining it, but hopefully this will help you sort of understand what you need to do and the certain things you can do to avoid doing it. But that was me. I'll see you all later. Have a good one. Adieu.